On September 11, 1973, fighter jets bombed the presidential palace. A nation known for its stability was about to be murdered by its military. 40 years of democracy were being blasted into rubble. Inside, the president gripped his AK-47, waiting for what came. He knew that when he died, the Constitution would die with him. But he was alone. As men rushed in, he squeezed the trigger and shots rang out, the first hitting a general in the head, killing him instantly. But behind him swept in more troops, and as his bullets ran low, the future was clear. In the final act of Chilean democracy, the president shot himself. Salvador Allende died on the floor of his office, his face posthumously smashed in by the butt of a rifle. The coup was successful. America would have its puppet. Pinochet had taken control. Salvador Allende had to die. He would often say that the people held the government, but they did not hold the power, and in him it would be proven correct. Sometimes a ballot is a menu from which certain items are only available until you try to order them. The 1970 Chilean election was exactly that. It was clear that those in power would never accept the results. Allende was offered, but he wasn't available. The CIA had sunk millions of dollars into making sure he lost. They'd organized a trucking crisis to crush his popularity. They conspired with his opponents across the entire continent, murdering those who stood in their way. And now, with his unexpected victory, Allende stood in their way. He had to die. Because Salvador Allende was a socialist, the first elected in the Americas through democratic means. What's more, he was a bit of a Marxist. Among his lofty goals as president were lowering income disparity, increasing access to healthcare and education, and most important to this story, nationalizing the economically vital copper industry. When he won, the power structure of Chile quaked beneath his feet. The reverberations were felt as far away as Washington, D.C. To many people, the concept of socialism seems like little more than a slippery slope to full-blown communism. Mention socialism on the internet to this day, and it's clear that few of its detractors are willing to see the difference. Politics rarely brings out the best in nuanced thinking. But if you think it's bad now, it was worse in 1970. At the height of the Cold War, there were few things more fearful to the West than the spread of communism. The outgoing president of Chile, Eduardo Frei, even went on an international campaign against Allende, alleging that if left unchecked, the government might slip into dictatorship and do what so many communist governments had done in the past. They would suspend the Constitution, they would remove personal freedom, they would collapse the economy, they would lock up political dissidents, they would purge their enemies, they'd likely even let foreign secret police into the country to help fulfill their nefarious ends. If Allende wasn't stopped, how could Chile feel secured in their democracy? How could they sustain their freedom going forward? Frei's message of dictatorial doom failed at home, but it stuck abroad. Foreigners may not have understood the complexities of Chile's political situation, but they understood the fear of communism. It didn't help that Allende spurned the United States, who at that time considered South America well within their sphere of control. He not only continued the nationalization of copper instituted by his predecessor, but he took it a step further. He demanded reparations. By the 1960s, American companies controlled nearly 80% of Chilean copper, then the most profitable resource in the country. Under Allende, they wouldn't just lose control, but they'd be forced to pay back the nation for 20 years of unchecked profits. In socialist Chile, public resources would be used for the benefit of Chileans, not foreign interests. And as you might expect, America was rightly pissed. Previous governments had allowed them to control these mines, and they weren't going to give them up willingly. They certainly weren't going to pay back what they'd already gained. Under the guidance of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the CIA decided to ramp up their efforts. But it wasn't that easy. The people really wanted Allende. After the midterm elections only solidified his power in Congress, they decided to go all out. If the people weren't going to pick the leader they wanted, they'd pick it for them. It was time for Allende to die. Operation Condor is one of those things you'd expect everyone to know about, and yet nobody ever seems to have heard of it. It was a nearly 30-year terrorism campaign run by the CIA in conjunction with representatives from extreme rightist and fascist elements from a half-dozen South American nations. The campaign lasted so long, it started at my father's birth and continued right up until I was in elementary school. An entire generation of terror. Together with secret police and ultra-right paramilitary groups from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil, the CIA oversaw the murder of tens of thousands of people and the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands more. They murdered union and trade representatives, students, religious leaders, politicians, artists, musicians, intellectuals, and many others who simply fought for a democratic voice. Chemical weapons used in high-profile assassinations were crafted in the secret bunkers of a Chilean Nazi cult. Operation Condor influenced elections across the continent, promoted puppet candidates who were willing to return natural resources to U.S. ownership, and dominated news outlets deemed favorable to American interests. No target was too lofty, and no country was safe. It saw assassinations on U.S. soil, and even death threats to U.S. congressmen who'd worked to stop its spread. It was, in no uncertain terms, a campaign of terror meant to install right-wing leaders against the will of their people, and it was incredibly effective. With the election of Allende, Chile became the prime target of Condor. Up until that point, they'd successfully held down left-wing democratic victories in every country on the continent. But Allende had defied the odds and won. The people were on his side. But as always, the people may have held the government, but they did not hold the power. His removal from office would come at the point of a gun. In 1970, Richard Nixon informed the CIA that, quote, "It is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown by a coup. It is imperative that these actions be implemented clandestinely and securely so that the American hand be well hidden." The first attempt came in June 1973, undertaken by military elements of the extreme right. It failed, but it taught the CIA the weak points of Allende's supporters, both in the public and the military. Information was gathered on his weapons, tactics, and where his supporters were willing to take to the streets. The next time, they'd be more prepared. On September 11, 1973, Chilean democracy died with a bang. The putsch came under the leadership of General Augusto Pinochet, and with help from the CIA, his fighter jets bombed the capital and his troops rushed in and took the nation. It was less a show to Allende that his time was over, and more of a display of power to the nation. Very few people supported the coup, but they couldn't fight an air force. With Allende dead, Pinochet unleashed a war against his own people. Hour by hour, day by day, he worked to destroy the institutions of democracy that had led to the leftist election victory. 2 days after the murder of Allende, he dissolved Congress. Those who disagreed were murdered. Over 130,000 people were imprisoned within the first 3 years of the dictatorship, a dictatorship that was to last for 15 years. Symbols of the left were destroyed or turned into detention centers. Popular artist hangouts became prisons for interrogation. Even those on the extreme right were shocked at the violence. A leader of the June coup attempt, who himself was a Pinochet supporter, expressed dismay at how vicious the overthrow had been. He was immediately arrested. In Santiago's National Stadium, Pinochet's secret police rounded up dissenters by the thousands. There, they would be tortured and ultimately murdered in cold blood. The stadium is today named after one of those victims, Victor Jara, Chile's answer to Bob Dylan. His only crime was writing songs that supported democracy. Pinochet's men broke his hands and laughed as they demanded he play guitar. When they were done torturing him, they shot him in the head. Thousands of people fled Chile, but Pinochet hunted them down. Allende's ambassador to the U.S. had his car bombed, killing him and his 26-year-old assistant alongside. Chile's greatest hero, Nobel Prize-winning poet Pablo Neruda, was injected with a form of mustard gas invented specifically for assassinations. Ex-President Eduardo Frei was poisoned to death with the very same toxin. The man who had gone around the world to warn about what might happen under Allende's potential communism was murdered by those put in place to stop it. To gain public favor, Pinochet and the CIA fabricated a series of documents that claimed that Allende's government had been planning a coup of their own. It's called the White Book, and it was used for decades to justify their actions. Working with friendly newspapers that had been infiltrated by Operation Condor, they repeated the lie verbatim. Soon it had disseminated throughout the West as fact. It's only in the last few decades that we've even come to know that Allende's government had no such plans. With little public support, they began a propaganda campaign around the economy. Economist Milton Friedman coined the term the miracle of Chile to describe the free market's effect on the dictatorship, and many others used it to show how by attracting international capital, Pinochet's coup had saved the nation from economic ruin. If you ask people today, particularly in rightist factions of the Americas, many would say that the coup was done in the name of the economy. It was the omelet, democracy was the eggs. But this too is a lie. Pinochet did not save the Chilean economy. He devastated it. The miracle only came after he was removed from power. Not to say that Allende's time had been much better. He was, after all, a Marxist socialist, and CIA Director Richard Helms had promised to, quote, make the economy scream. But it should come as little surprise that the economic policy of a repressive dictatorship was not a blessing to the average person. Under Pinochet, the nation saw two of the greatest economic collapses in Chilean history. It saw decreased wages, mass unemployment reaching nearly 20%, and a retaking of the copper industry by foreign hands. It was only after the second major crash that the government centralized control of the economy and things stabilized. It was a centralizing action beyond that even which Allende would have attempted. The only miracle here was that the economy survived until democracy returned. I am not a communist. I personally probably wouldn't have voted for Allende. I don't believe that his policies were better than those of his predecessor. But I am a firm believer in the rights of people to choose their own fate. For all its faults, I truly believe in democracy. To me, the problem is not the left or right, it's the extreme. And I wonder if the people who hate communism so vocally know what happens when they erode democracy to destroy it. Because why do so many people hate it? Is it not their secret police, their purges, their erosion of personal and political freedoms? Is it not that we worry they'll crash the economy for political interests or lock up innocent people who disagree with their plans? Pinochet did all those things and more. Yet the people who despised communism supported him. They gave him power, and for decades they've been lying about his record to make us believe he wasn't what we all know he was. Simply because he wasn't a communist. He was right-wing, like them. But look at where it got us. Salvador Allende was not Jesus. He didn't have all the answers for Chile. His attempts to fix the economy appeared to be backfiring only a few years into power. Chances are, within a few elections more, he'd have failed and been voted out. But he didn't get the chance to fail. His country didn't get the chance to fail with him. Instead, they were handed repression, purges, and economic ruin in its place. Failure came at the point of a gun, not a ballot box. We're now 30 years past the day when Pinochet lost power, and Chileans can make their voices heard once again. And considering who they've voted for, it would be hard not to see the past few decades as a symbolic rejection of what America had imposed. Socialism returned to Chile without slipping into communism, and after 6 years bounced away again as elections reflected the changing national mood. They renationalized the copper and have seen some of the highest rates of sustained economic growth in the entire world. Their democracy is stable, arguably the best in South America. Piece by piece, voters have rebuilt the path their nation was on before the coup began. In 1994, they elected Eduardo Frei, the son of the president who Pinochet had poisoned. In 2014, the first female head of the Chilean Senate was selected by her party, the Socialists. Her name was Isabel Allende, the daughter of the president who simply had to die. Today, the people of Chile hold the government, but the question of if they hold the power hangs over their heads like a stone, because they've all seen what happens when they lose democracy. They've seen it bleeding to death on the floor of its office. They've seen its face smashed in by fascists. This is Rare Earth.